900,000 years ago, humanity may have come closer to extinction than anyone ever imagined. Not during an ice age and not during a war, not during a global catastrophe remembered in legend, but in a forgotten chapter of prehistory so ancient that almost all evidence has vanished. According to recent genetic research, our ancestors may have been reduced to a shockingly small population, perhaps just a few thousand survivors carrying the future of the entire human species. How did they survive when so many others disappeared? And what traces of that ancient crisis are still hidden inside every person alive today? Before we journey back into one of the greatest mysteries of human evolution, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy deep history, ancient mysteries, and the untold stories of our distant past. Now, let's travel back 900,000 years to the moment humanity almost vanished forever. The world is silent in a way that no human being has ever experienced. No cities glow against the darkness, no roads cut across continents, no fields stretch toward the horizon. There are no ships at sea, no monuments, no languages written into stone. The planet belongs almost entirely to wind, water, ice, and the countless creatures moving through landscapes that seem endless. Across vast plains, herds migrate beneath changing skies. Forests spread across regions that will one day become deserts. Rivers wander through valleys untouched by dams or bridges. Humanity exists, but only barely, scattered in small groups across an immense and often unforgiving world. Yet hidden within this ancient silence lies one of the most extraordinary mysteries ever uncovered about our species. According to a growing body of genetic research, there may have been a moment nearly 900,000 years ago when the ancestors of every living human came dangerously close to disappearing altogether. Not declining slightly, not suffering a regional setback, coming frighteningly close to extinction. If the evidence is correct, the human population may have fallen to astonishingly low numbers for an extended period of time. For generation after generation, perhaps for thousands of years, the entire future of humanity may have rested in the lives of a surprisingly small number of individuals struggling to survive environmental upheaval on a changing planet. The implications are difficult to grasp. Every city that exists today, every culture, every language, every scientific discovery, every empire that rose and fell, every family alive right now, all of it may trace back through an incredibly narrow doorway in time, a moment when our lineage nearly vanished from Earth. The story begins not with ancient monuments or lost civilizations, but with something far stranger. It begins inside the cells of living people. For most of human history, nobody suspected such an event had occurred. Ancient myth spoke of floods, disasters, and worlds destroyed. But no tradition preserved a memory stretching back nearly 1,000,000 years. The timescales involved are simply too vast. Entire species appear and disappear within such spans. Mountains rise, coastlines shift. Forests become grasslands and then forests again. The evidence for this ancient crisis emerged only recently through the study of genetics. Modern humans carry within their DNA an extraordinary historical archive. Every generation passes genetic information forward. Tiny mutations accumulate over immense periods of time. Most seem insignificant, but together they create patterns that allow scientists to reconstruct parts of the distant past. In a sense, every living person carries fragments of a story written long before recorded history began. Researchers studying these patterns noticed something unusual. Human genetic diversity appeared unexpectedly limited, compared with what might be expected from a species spread across the globe. The amount of variation suggested that our ancestors had passed through an exceptionally narrow demographic bottleneck at some point in the remote past. Population bottlenecks are not unusual in nature. They occur when a species experiences a sharp decline in numbers. A flood, drought, volcanic eruption, disease outbreak, climatic shift, or ecological collapse can drastically reduce a population. If only a small number survive, future generations inherit only a fraction of the original genetic diversity. The effect is similar to taking a large library and reducing it to a handful of surviving books. No matter how much the collection expands afterward, many of the original volumes are gone forever. Scientists have documented bottlenecks in numerous species. Certain animals hunted nearly to extinction still bear genetic signatures of those reductions. Some isolated island populations reveal evidence of dramatic demographic collapses. The principle itself is well established. What made the human case so remarkable was the proposed timing and severity. The event appeared to occur hundreds of thousands of years before the emergence of modern humans. It belonged to a period so distant that even many familiar prehistoric species had not yet evolved. The world looked different. Human ancestors looked different. Entire ecosystems operated under conditions unfamiliar to us today. And yet the descendants of those ancient survivors may include every human being now alive. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The mystery becomes even more compelling when one considers how little direct evidence survives from this era. 900,000 years is an almost incomprehensible length of time. Archaeological sites erode away, rivers alter their courses, sediments bury ancient landscapes beneath hundreds of feet of younger deposits. Bones vanish. Entire environments disappear without leaving obvious traces. Much of what happened during that period must be reconstructed indirectly. Scientists combine clues from genetics, geology, paleoclimatology, archaeology, and evolutionary biology. Each discipline contributes fragments of a puzzle whose edges remain incomplete. Sometimes those fragments fit together elegantly. Sometimes they appear contradictory. Scholars still debate exactly what occurred, how severe the crisis may have been, and whether the proposed population estimates fully reflect reality. The evidence remains incomplete, yet even the uncertainties are fascinating. Imagine standing on a hillside in Africa nearly 1 million years ago. The land stretches toward distant horizons. Somewhere beyond those horizons live other groups of humans, though human is a term that means something slightly different at this stage of evolution. They possess intelligence, adaptability, and social bonds. But their world lacks the technologies that later generations will take for granted. There is no agriculture, no permanent architecture, no stored food reserves capable of sustaining communities through years of hardship. Survival depends directly upon the landscape. Water sources, edible plants, animal migrations, weather patterns, and seasonal cycles shape every aspect of life. When those systems function normally, populations can persist. When they begin to fail, the consequences can be catastrophic. Around this time, Earth itself appears to be entering a period of increasing climatic instability. The rhythms governing the planet's environment are shifting. Cooling trends intensify. Glacial cycles become more pronounced. Ecosystems begin reorganizing on enormous scales. At first, the changes may seem gradual. A forest thins, a wet region becomes drier, animal populations alter their migration routes, small adjustments accumulate year after year, then larger transformations emerge. Habitats shrink, resources become less predictable, regions capable of supporting human populations contract, groups become isolated from one another, survival grows more difficult. No single explanation fully accounts for what happened next. The ancient record offers hints rather than certainty, but what survives in the evidence suggests that humanity entered one of the most dangerous periods in its entire existence. Some populations disappear, others struggle, a few endure, and somewhere within that struggle lies the reason any of us are here at all. Because if the bottleneck hypothesis is correct, there was nothing inevitable about humanity's future. The species that eventually built civilizations, crossed oceans, mapped the stars, and transformed the planet may once have existed on the edge of oblivion, balanced precariously between survival and extinction. The remarkable fact is not merely that humans evolved. The remarkable fact is that they survived long enough to do so. And to understand how close that survival may have come to failure, we must first return to the world that existed before the Great Narrowing began, when human ancestors still occupied a broader and more diverse landscape, unaware that one of the greatest tests in their history was already approaching. Long before the suspected bottleneck narrowed humanity's future into a fragile thread, the human story appears far more expansive than many people imagine. Nearly 900,000 years ago, our ancestors are not alone on the planet, nor are they recent arrivals. The human lineage already stretches deep into the past. Millions of years of evolution have produced a variety of hominin species, each adapting to different environments and challenges. The world contains not one straightforward path toward modern humanity, but a tangled family tree with many branches, some flourishing for long periods before disappearing entirely. Africa remains the center of this story. For hundreds of thousands of years, changing climates have repeatedly transformed the continent. Forests expand and contract, grasslands spread across vast regions, lakes appear and vanish, rivers alter their courses. These shifting landscapes create both opportunities and dangers for the populations living within them. Human ancestors adapt by becoming increasingly flexible. Earlier hominins had already developed the ability to walk efficiently on two legs, freeing their hands for carrying, gathering, and tool use. Over immense spans of time, brains gradually increase in size. Social cooperation becomes more sophisticated. Individuals learn to exploit a wider range of environments and food sources. This adaptability may be one of the most important traits ever acquired by our lineage. Unlike highly specialized animals that thrive only under specific conditions, humans increasingly survive through behavioral flexibility. When environments change, they do not merely rely on biological evolution. They adjust their strategies, alter their movements, and exploit new opportunities. Even so, there are limits. The world before the bottleneck remains a difficult place in which to survive. Daily life revolves around constant challenges, finding water, locating food, avoiding predators, protecting offspring, maintaining social bonds. Every generation faces pressures that modern people rarely encounter directly. The archaeological record offers glimpses into these ancient lives. Stone tools appear across multiple regions, providing some of the most durable evidence left behind by prehistoric populations. Unlike wood, plant fibers, or animal hides, stone survives for hundreds of thousands of years. A simple hand axe abandoned near a riverbank can outlast entire civilizations. These tools reveal something important. They demonstrate planning. A shaped stone is not a random object. It represents intention. Someone selected raw material, recognized its properties, and transformed it into something useful. Even the simplest tool embodies knowledge passed between individuals and generations. Some sites suggest remarkable continuity. Particular tool traditions persist for astonishing lengths of time, indicating stable cultural transmission long before writing or formal education exist. The people creating these tools are often associated with species such as Homo erectus, one of the most successful hominins in evolutionary history. Homo erectus deserves far more attention than it usually receives. Emerging long before modern humans, this species survives for an extraordinary duration. Members of Homo erectus spread across large portions of Africa and Eurasia. They occupy environments ranging from tropical regions to more temperate zones. Their geographic reach exceeds that of many earlier hominins. For the first time, human ancestors become travelers on a continental scale. Their movements reshape the human story. Groups disperse across unfamiliar landscapes, encountering new climates, plants, animals, and ecological pressures. Some populations become separated by distance. Others remain connected through occasional migrations. Over time, regional differences emerge. The result is not a single uniform humanity, but a mosaic of populations scattered across enormous territories. This diversity may prove crucial. Before the bottleneck, there appears to be enough geographic spread that environmental disasters affecting one region do not necessarily eliminate everyone. Different groups occupy different habitats. Some depend heavily on grassland resources, others exploit woodland environments. Some live near rivers and lakes. Others inhabit more open terrain. The human lineage possesses options. Yet these options remain tied to the stability of the natural world. A productive landscape can support growing populations. A deteriorating landscape can quickly become dangerous. One lesser-known detail from this period involves the scale of environmental abundance that occasionally existed. Certain African regions supported enormous lake systems far larger than many modern observers realize. Wetlands stretched across broad areas. Rivers connected habitats that later became isolated. Animal populations often flourished under favorable conditions. To human groups living nearby, these regions would have represented vital centers of life. Water attracted animals. Animals attracted predators. Humans followed both. Entire social worlds likely revolved around such ecological hubs. The archaeological traces are fragmentary, but they suggest populations capable of adapting to varied conditions while maintaining increasingly complex behaviors. Cooperation becomes particularly important. Large prey animals cannot always be exploited by solitary individuals. Information about resources must be shared. Children require extended care compared with many other mammals. Social bonds become survival tools. In some respects, this may be among the greatest evolutionary innovations ever achieved by our lineage. A lone human ancestor is vulnerable. A coordinated group becomes far more resilient. Knowledge accumulates. Skills transfer between generations. Risks are distributed across communities. Injuries that would prove fatal in isolation may become survivable within supportive social networks. These advantages help explain why human ancestors expand into so many environments. Yet success creates its own vulnerabilities. As populations spread, they become increasingly dependent upon ecological systems operating within relatively predictable limits. Rainfall patterns matter, seasonal cycles matter, the distribution of plants and animals matters. A prolonged disruption can ripple through every aspect of life. The evidence suggests that during much of this era, Earth's climate is entering a new phase of instability. The planet has always experienced climatic fluctuations, but something significant appears to be developing during the broader time frame surrounding the suspected bottleneck. Glacial cycles intensify. Environmental transitions become more dramatic. Habitats begin shifting on continental scales. At first glance, these changes may seem distant from the daily experiences of small human groups. No one observes global climate charts. No one understands orbital cycles or atmospheric chemistry. Instead, change arrives through immediate realities. A water source shrinks. A familiar migration route disappears. A hunting ground becomes less productive. Vegetation patterns alter. Seasonal expectations fail. The cumulative effect can be devastating. For highly mobile populations, movement offers one solution. Groups can relocate when local conditions deteriorate, but migration is not always simple. Suitable territory may already be occupied. New environments may contain unfamiliar dangers. Distances can be immense. And if environmental disruption occurs across large regions simultaneously, relocation may provide only temporary relief. This possibility becomes increasingly important as scientists attempt to reconstruct conditions leading up to the bottleneck. What makes the mystery so compelling is that the populations involved are not primitive in the sense often imagined. They are survivors already shaped by millions of years of evolutionary success. They have expanded across continents. They possess tools, social structures, and behavioral flexibility. Under ordinary circumstances, these strengths should offer protection. Yet something appears to have happened that overwhelmed many of those advantages. The details remain uncertain. The evidence does not preserve a dramatic moment frozen in time. There is no single catastrophe layer pointing unambiguously to one event. Instead, researchers see indications of prolonged stress, environmental transformation, and demographic decline unfolding across thousands of years. The world that once supported diverse human populations may gradually become less hospitable. Habitats fragment. Groups become isolated. Numbers begin falling. The great narrowing has not yet arrived, but the conditions that may eventually produce it are already taking shape beneath the surface of daily life. Far above the concerns of any human ancestor, Earth itself is changing course, entering a period of climatic instability that will reshape landscapes, alter ecosystems, and perhaps push our lineage closer to extinction than it has ever been before. The changes begin so slowly that no individual could possibly recognize their full significance. A child is born beside a river that has flowed reliably for generations. By the time that child grows old, the river may run lower than before, but it still exists. The difference seems manageable. Life continues. Families adapt. Animals remain present. Seasons still arrive, even if they no longer behave exactly as expected. Yet across centuries and millennia, these small changes accumulate into something enormous. The Earth of 900,000 years ago is not a static world. It is a planet constantly responding to powerful forces operating on scales far beyond human experience. The position of continents, the circulation of oceans, the chemistry of the atmosphere, and subtle variations in Earth's orbit all interact in ways that influence global climate. Most of these processes remain invisible to the people living through them. Their effects, however, become impossible to ignore. By this period, Earth is well within the broader ice age that began millions of years earlier. Despite the name, an ice age does not mean the entire planet is covered by ice. Instead, it refers to a long-term climatic state in which large ice sheets exist and periodically expand and contract. For hundreds of thousands of years, glaciers advance and retreat across parts of the northern hemisphere. Vast quantities of water become locked within ice. Sea levels rise and fall. Weather patterns shift. Ecosystems reorganize. What appears to be happening around the time of the proposed bottleneck is particularly significant. Many paleoclimate researchers point to a transition known as the mid-Pleistocene transition, a major change in Earth's glacial cycles that unfolds between roughly 1.2 million and 700,000 years ago. Before this shift, glacial cycles tend to follow one rhythm. Afterward, they become longer, more intense, and often more severe. The exact mechanisms remain an active area of research. Scholars still debate why the transition occurred and how various climatic factors interacted. No single explanation fully accounts for every detail. Yet the overall picture is clear enough. The planet's climate system is becoming more volatile. Periods of cooling deepen. Environmental fluctuations grow stronger. The consequences spread across continents. In Africa, where much of the human story remains centered, climate plays a particularly powerful role. Rainfall patterns determine the extent of lakes, wetlands, grasslands, and forests. Even relatively modest shifts in precipitation can dramatically alter landscapes. When rainfall increases, vegetation expands, rivers swell, animal populations often flourish. When rainfall decreases, entire ecosystems can contract. The difference between abundance and scarcity may depend upon changes that seem minor when viewed globally, but prove life-changing at the local level. Evidence from ancient sediments, fossil pollen, lake deposits, and geological records suggest that parts of Africa experience repeated cycles of environmental instability. Wet phases alternate with dry phases. Habitats appear and disappear. Regions that once support rich ecosystems become increasingly challenging. Imagine a landscape that generations have depended upon. Water gathers in familiar locations. Trees provide shade and edible resources. Animals migrate through predictable routes. Knowledge accumulated over centuries helps communities survive. Then conditions begin changing. The lake shrinks. Grasslands expand into former woodlands. Some species decline while others move elsewhere. What was once a reliable source of food becomes uncertain. For a small population already living close to environmental limits, such disruptions can become dangerous very quickly. One of the most striking aspects of prehistoric climate change is the sheer scale involved. Modern people often think in terms of years or decades. Ancient climatic transformations can reshape regions over thousands of years. To those experiencing them, the changes feel gradual, yet they are relentless. There is no return to normal because the definition of normal itself is shifting. Human groups must constantly adapt. Those unable to adjust disappear. Those capable of flexibility survive a little longer. Meanwhile, other species face similar pressures. The fossil record reveals a world in motion. Animal populations expand, contract, migrate, and sometimes vanish entirely. Predators follow prey into new territories. Herbivores track changing vegetation zones. Entire ecological communities reorganize. This instability creates opportunities as well as dangers. New habitats emerge. Old competitors disappear. Novel resources become available. Yet periods of rapid environmental change often favor generalists over specialists. Species capable of exploiting diverse resources tend to fare better than those dependent upon narrow ecological niches. Human ancestors possess certain advantages in this regard. Their intelligence, social cooperation, and behavioral flexibility allow them to respond creatively to challenges. But adaptability is not the same as invulnerability. Even highly resilient species can be pushed beyond their limits when environmental stress becomes widespread enough. Some researchers suspect that this is precisely what begins happening during the period leading toward the bottleneck. Instead of a single catastrophic event, there may be a convergence of pressures. Cooling climates reduce the stability of key habitats. Changing rainfall patterns disrupt ecosystems. Food resources become less predictable. Populations fragment across increasingly isolated regions. Each factor alone might be survivable. Together they create escalating risk. One lesser-known clue comes from the timing of changes observed in both environmental records and aspects of human evolution. Around this general time frame, the fossil record becomes unusually sparse in certain regions. This absence does not prove population collapse by itself. Fossils are notoriously incomplete. Entire populations can leave little trace behind. Nevertheless, some scientists find the coincidence intriguing. If human numbers were indeed declining, fewer individuals would naturally leave behind fewer fossils. The archaeological silence may not be definitive evidence, but it fits a broader pattern. Still, caution is essential. The evidence remains incomplete. Ancient landscapes preserve information unevenly. Geological processes destroy countless sites. Erosion removes evidence. Sediments bury others beyond discovery. What appears absent today may simply remain hidden. This uncertainty lies at the heart of the mystery. Researchers are attempting to reconstruct events that occurred nearly 1 million years ago using fragments scattered across multiple scientific disciplines. Every new discovery adds detail, but none provides a complete picture. Yet despite these limitations, the overall trend appears difficult to ignore. The world inhabited by human ancestors is becoming increasingly unpredictable. Regions that once support substantial populations may no longer do so. Migration routes become more challenging. Environmental refuges shrink. Competition intensifies around surviving resources. The situation resembles a slow tightening rather than a sudden blow. Imagine a vast network gradually losing connections. Groups separated by growing distances encounter one another less frequently. Genetic exchange decreases. Local disasters become harder to recover from. Population resilience weakens. Over time, even modest losses accumulate. What makes this particularly dangerous is that demographic decline often becomes self-reinforcing. Smaller populations possess fewer potential mates, less genetic diversity, and reduced capacity to recover from additional shocks. A difficult year becomes more damaging. A drought becomes more serious. A local extinction becomes harder to replace. The margin for error narrows. By the latter part of this period, some scientists believe humanity's ancestors may already be approaching a critical threshold. They do not know it. No one can see the broader pattern unfolding across continents and generations. Individuals focus on immediate survival, finding food, locating water, protecting families, enduring another season. Yet from the perspective of deep time, something extraordinary may be taking place. The human lineage, after millions of years of evolution and expansion, appears to be drifting toward one of the most dangerous bottlenecks in its history. And the first unmistakable clues that this narrowing occurred will not come from fossils, stone tools, or ancient landscapes. They will come from a discovery hidden inside the DNA of people living hundreds of thousands of years later. For most of the 20th century, the idea that humanity may have passed through an extreme population bottleneck nearly 900,000 years ago would have sounded almost impossible to test. How could anyone measure the size of a population that lived so far beyond the reach of written history? There are no census records, no settlements to excavate, no chronicles describing droughts or migrations. Even fossils, rare as they are, reveal only isolated individuals scattered across immense stretches of time. The problem seems unsolvable, and yet the answer may have been quietly travelling through history all along, carried inside every human being. The emergence of modern genetics transformed the study of the distant past. Suddenly, scientists possessed a new kind of historical archive, one written not in stone or clay but in biological code. DNA preserves traces of ancestry across countless generations. While it cannot reveal everything, it can sometimes expose patterns invisible in the archaeological record. The principle is surprisingly straightforward. Every child inherits genetic material from their parents. Over time, Small mutations occur naturally, most are harmless, some disappear, others persist and spread through populations. As these changes accumulate generation after generation, they create measurable patterns. When scientists examine large numbers of genomes, those patterns become a record of population history. Large populations tend to preserve greater genetic diversity. Small populations preserve less. When a species experiences a dramatic decline, part of its genetic variation disappears forever. Future generations inherit only the diversity carried by the survivors. The effect can remain detectable long after population numbers recover. In a sense, DNA remembers events that no living mind could possibly recall. Over recent decades, researchers developed increasingly sophisticated methods for reconstructing ancient population dynamics. Powerful computers allowed scientists to compare genetic information from people around the world and estimate how ancestral populations may have changed over time. Some results confirmed expectations. Others produced surprises. Among the most intriguing findings was evidence suggesting that humanity's ancestral population may have experienced an exceptionally severe decline deep in the Middle Pleistocene, roughly around 900,000 years ago. The proposed bottleneck stood out not merely because it existed, but because of its apparent magnitude. According to one influential genetic analysis, the effective breeding population of human ancestors may have fallen to extraordinarily low levels for an extended period. The exact numbers depend on assumptions and modeling techniques, but the study suggested a population far smaller than many researchers expected. The headlines that followed were dramatic. Some reports described humanity being reduced to only a few thousand individuals. Others emphasized even smaller estimates for effective breeding populations, numbers that sounded alarmingly close to extinction. As often happens in science, the reality was more nuanced. The term effective population size does not refer directly to the total number of living individuals. Instead, it represents a statistical measure related to how genetic diversity is passed between generations. The actual population may have been larger than the genetic estimates imply. Even so, the signal remained striking. Something unusual appears to have happened. The genetic evidence suggests that human ancestors lost a substantial amount of diversity during this period, consistent with a major demographic contraction. The question is why? To understand the significance, imagine tracing every living person backward through time. At first, the numbers expand rapidly. Each individual has 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and so on. But eventually the process encounters limits. Family lines overlap, ancestors are shared, populations merge. As researchers reconstruct these patterns genetically, they discover that the ancestry of modern humans narrows dramatically at certain points in the past. One of the most remarkable narrowing events appears to occur around the time frame associated with the proposed bottleneck. It is as if countless branches of a tree suddenly converge into a much thinner trunk. The image is powerful because it captures the central mystery. What happened to all the missing branches? Where did the diversity go? Why do modern humans carry signs of such a profound reduction? These questions have generated enormous interest because the implications extend far beyond population statistics. A severe bottleneck could influence the course of evolution itself. When populations become small, chance plays a larger role in determining which genetic traits survive. Some variations disappear entirely. Others become more common simply because they happen to exist among the survivors. In effect, near-extinction events can reshape the future of a species. The survivors do not merely continue the story. They become the story. Every later generation inherits the consequences of their survival. This possibility makes the ancient bottleneck one of the most consequential events in human history, if it occurred in the way some models suggest. Yet the scientific community remains cautious. Genetic reconstructions are powerful tools, but they are not perfect windows into the past. They rely on assumptions about mutation rates, population structure, migration patterns, and other factors that can influence results. Scholars still debate how precisely the bottleneck should be interpreted. Some researchers view the genetic evidence as compelling support for a genuine population collapse. Others argue that complex population structures could produce similar signals without requiring such extreme reductions in total numbers. A fragmented population spread across isolated regions might leave a genetic signature resembling a bottleneck, even if more individuals survive than the models initially suggest. This distinction matters. The difference between a few thousand individuals and a more dispersed but larger population changes how scientists reconstruct the crisis. Nevertheless, even many skeptical researchers agree that something significant appears to have occurred during this period. The genetic signal is difficult to dismiss entirely. What remains uncertain is the exact nature of the event that produced it. One particularly fascinating aspect involves timing. The proposed bottleneck seems to coincide broadly with environmental instability, documented through geological and climatic evidence. Around the same era, Earth experiences major climatic transitions, shifting ecosystems, and increasingly severe glacial cycles. This overlap is not proof of causation, but it is suggestive. When independent lines of evidence begin pointing toward the same general period, scientists naturally pay attention. The possibility emerges that environmental transformations may have driven demographic collapse. Perhaps shrinking habitats reduced population sizes. Perhaps repeated climatic shocks fragmented communities. Perhaps multiple factors interacted over thousands of years. No single explanation fully accounts for everything observed. Yet the convergence of evidence becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. DNA points toward a dramatic reduction. Climate records reveal growing instability. The fossil record grows frustratingly sparse. Together, these clues begin forming the outline of a remarkable story. Not a story of sudden annihilation, but of gradual narrowing. Not a single disaster, but a prolonged struggle. Not the extinction of humanity, but something that may have come uncomfortably close. The deeper researchers look into the genetic evidence, the more astonishing the implications become. Because if the bottleneck estimates are even approximately correct, the number of surviving ancestors may have been far smaller than most people would ever imagine. Humanity's future may once have rested in the lives of a tiny remnant population scattered across an increasingly hostile world. And understanding just how small that remnant might have been leads directly into the most startling part of the mystery. Numbers have a peculiar power. A landscape can be difficult to visualize. A climate trend can feel abstract. Even a span of hundreds of thousands of years often escapes ordinary intuition. But when scientists begin discussing how many individuals may have survived an ancient crisis, the scale of the mystery suddenly becomes more tangible. The figures associated with the proposed human bottleneck are startling precisely because they seem so small. If the genetic models are broadly correct, humanity's ancestral population may have contracted to a level that would appear alarmingly vulnerable by modern standards. Some analyses suggest an effective breeding population numbering only around 1,000 individuals, perhaps even fewer during certain intervals. Translating such figures into actual population size is complicated, but even conservative interpretations imply a severe demographic decline. To appreciate what this means, it helps to step away from percentages and statistics. Imagine an entire species spread across a continent. Then imagine that species shrinking generation after generation, not disappearing overnight, not collapsing in a single catastrophic year. Instead, slowly losing people, communities, and connections. Small groups vanish. Others become isolated. Regions once occupied are abandoned. The geographic range contracts. The total number of survivors grows steadily smaller. Eventually, the future of the species depends on a remarkably limited pool of individuals. At that point, survival becomes a very different challenge. Large populations possess a kind of built-in resilience. They can absorb losses. If one group suffers a drought, another may flourish elsewhere. If a local disaster strikes, migrants can help replenish affected areas. Genetic diversity remains relatively abundant. Small populations operate under harsher rules. Every death matters more. Every failed generation carries greater consequences. Every environmental shock becomes potentially decisive. The danger is not merely numerical, it is biological. Genetic diversity functions like a reserve of possibilities. Different traits, variations, and adaptations circulate through a population. Some may prove useful when conditions change unexpectedly. When diversity declines, future flexibility can decline as well. This phenomenon affects countless species. Modern conservation biologists encounter it regularly. Animals reduced to small populations often face challenges extending beyond immediate survival. Inbreeding can increase. Harmful mutations may become more common. The capacity to adapt to new environmental pressures can weaken. The situation becomes especially serious when populations remain small for extended periods. And according to some interpretations of the genetic evidence, that may be exactly what happened to human ancestors. Rather than a brief collapse lasting a few generations, the bottleneck may have persisted for a surprisingly long time. Thousands of years. Perhaps even well over 100,000 years. Such timescales are almost impossible to imagine from a modern perspective. Entire civilizations have risen and fallen within far shorter periods. The ancient survivors were not waiting for a temporary crisis to pass. For them, the crisis may have been the normal condition of life. Children were born into scarcity. Their descendants inherited the same challenges. Generation followed generation without any awareness that they were living through one of the most consequential demographic contractions in human history. One of the most fascinating aspects of this scenario is how ordinary daily life might still have appeared from within it. The survivors did not know their population size. They did not possess maps showing distant regions. They had no concept of species-wide demographics. A family gathering around a fire would see only the people immediately around them. A hunter tracking animals across a valley would observe local conditions, not continental trends. Even if humanity as a whole was approaching dangerous levels, individuals experienced life through a much narrower lens. This creates a striking contrast between lived reality and scientific reconstruction. Today, researchers can examine genetic patterns spanning hundreds of thousands of years and recognize the broader picture. The people who endured the bottleneck never saw that picture. They simply survived one day at a time. The numbers themselves remain a subject of debate. Scholars are careful to emphasize that effective population size does not equal head count. The actual number of living individuals could have been considerably larger than the genetic estimate suggests. Furthermore, ancient populations were likely structured in complex ways. Some groups may have remained relatively isolated. Others may have exchanged genes only occasionally. Migration patterns could influence the genetic signals observed today. For these reasons, scientists avoid treating specific numerical estimates as exact counts. The uncertainty matters. Yet even when allowing for substantial margins of error, the broader conclusion remains striking. Human ancestry appears to pass through an unusually narrow demographic corridor. The genetic evidence consistently points toward a period when diversity declined sharply and population sizes became much smaller than before. The mystery shifts from whether a reduction occurred to understanding how severe it was and what caused it. One clue comes from comparisons with other species. Many large mammals experience population fluctuations driven by environmental conditions. During favorable periods, numbers expand. During difficult periods, they contract. Human ancestors were not exempt from these ecological realities. Despite intelligence and adaptability, they remained deeply dependent on natural systems. Food did not come from stored agricultural reserves. Water did not flow through engineered infrastructure. Everything depended on landscapes functioning properly. When those landscapes deteriorated, the effects could cascade rapidly through populations. A drying region supports fewer animals. Fewer animals mean less food. Reduced food availability lowers survival rates. Population decline follows. If neighboring regions are experiencing similar pressures, migration becomes less effective as a solution. Gradually, local crises become regional crises. Regional crises become continental challenges. The margin separating survival from extinction narrows. There is another unsettling implication hidden within the bottleneck hypothesis. If populations became extremely small, then simple chance may have played an enormous role in determining the future of humanity. History often feels inevitable when viewed backward. Modern civilization exists, so it is tempting to assume it was always destined to emerge. The bottleneck suggests otherwise. A disease outbreak affecting a small population, a prolonged drought striking a critical refuge, the loss of a handful of key groups. Any of these events might have altered the trajectory of our lineage. The farther population numbers fall, the greater the influence of randomness. Entire branches of human ancestry may have disappeared through no fault of their own. Some communities may have occupied regions that became uninhabitable. Others may have encountered environmental pressures from which recovery proved impossible. What survives in the genetic record is not a catalogue of individual tragedies, but the cumulative result of countless local outcomes. Every extinct group represents a story lost beyond recovery. No names survive. No memories remain. Only the demographic shadow they left behind. This is one reason the bottleneck remains so compelling. It transforms humanity's deep history from a tale of steady progress into something far more fragile. The ancestors of modern humans were not marching inevitably towards success. They were navigating uncertainty, sometimes surviving, sometimes failing, always vulnerable to forces larger than themselves. And if population numbers truly reach the levels suggested by some models, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Where did the survivors endure? What landscapes remained habitable when so many others may have become hostile? Somewhere on a changing continent, small groups of human ancestors managed to persist while countless others vanished from the record. To understand how that happened, we must return to Africa itself, where environmental pressures were reshaping the world of the survivors in ways that may have pushed humanity to the brink. If humanity truly approached the edge of extinction around 900,000 years ago, the struggle was almost certainly fought not in a single location, but across a vast and changing African landscape. Africa during the Middle Pleistocene is neither uniform wilderness nor a stable environment. It is a continent of extraordinary ecological diversity. Dense forests occupy some regions. Open grasslands stretch across others. Mountain ranges influence rainfall patterns. Rivers carve through valleys. Great lakes expand and contract with changing climate cycles. For human ancestors, this diversity is both a blessing and a challenge. Different environments offer different opportunities. A population thriving beside a lake may depend on resources unavailable elsewhere. Another group living near grasslands may follow migrating animals across enormous distances. Yet this diversity also means that environmental disruptions affect regions unevenly. Some areas suffer sooner. Others remain productive longer. The crucial question is whether enough favourable habitats survive to shelter human populations during periods of extreme stress. Researchers often use the term refugia to describe places that remain habitable while surrounding regions deteriorate. Throughout natural history, refugia have played a critical role in survival. During ice ages, droughts, and ecological crises, species frequently persist in isolated pockets of suitable habitat before expanding again when conditions improve. The concept may be central to the bottleneck mystery. If large portions of Africa become increasingly difficult to inhabit, surviving populations may have retreated into scattered refuges where water, vegetation, and animal resources remained relatively reliable. Finding evidence for such refugees nearly 1 million years later is extraordinarily difficult. Landscapes change, ancient shorelines disappear, sediments accumulate. Erosion destroys traces of occupation. What survives in the record offers only fragments. Yet those fragments suggest a continent undergoing profound environmental fluctuations. Lake systems that once covered vast areas begin changing dramatically. Some shrink, others disappear entirely. Wetlands contract. Rivers become less predictable. The ecological networks upon which animals and humans depend begin to fragment. To modern observers, the loss of a lake may seem like a local event. In prehistoric Africa, it could transform entire regions. Large lakes function as ecological engines. They support vegetation, attract animals, influence local climates, and provide dependable water sources. Around them, life concentrates. When such systems decline, the consequences spread outward. Animal populations disperse. Predators follow. Plant communities change. Human groups lose critical resources. The effects ripple through entire ecosystems. Imagine a community that has depended on a productive landscape for generations. Children grow up learning where to find water during dry seasons. Hunters understand migration routes. Gatherers know which plants become available at different times of year. This knowledge represents accumulated survival experience. Then conditions begin shifting. The water source shrinks. Animals arrive less frequently. Vegetation changes. The old knowledge becomes less reliable. Adaptation becomes necessary. Some groups succeed. Others do not. This process may have unfolded repeatedly across thousands of years. One particularly important factor is unpredictability. Human populations can often cope with hardship when conditions remain consistent. A dry environment may still support life if people understand its rhythms. The greater challenge emerges when those rhythms break down. Rainfall becomes erratic. Seasons fluctuate unexpectedly. Resource availability changes from one generation to the next. Planning becomes more difficult. Risk increases. In such environments, even experienced communities face mounting challenges. Paleoclimate evidence suggests that parts of Africa experienced exactly this kind of instability during the broader period associated with the bottleneck. Rather than a single environmental state, conditions oscillated between wetter and drier phases. Habitats expanded and contracted repeatedly. The result was a landscape in constant transition. Some researchers believe these fluctuations may have fragmented human populations into increasingly isolated groups. Isolation carries consequences. When populations become separated, opportunities for interaction decline. genetic exchange becomes less frequent, cultural knowledge spreads more slowly, small groups become more vulnerable to local disasters. A drought affecting one isolated population can have far greater consequences than the same drought affecting a well-connected network of communities. The bottleneck hypothesis becomes easier to imagine under such conditions, not because one catastrophe wipes out humanity, but because repeated environmental pressures gradually erode resilience. A population loses a little ground, then a little more, then more again. Each setback reduces flexibility. Recovery becomes increasingly difficult. Eventually, only a limited number of favourable habitats remain. Survival depends on reaching them and enduring within them. One lesser-known aspect of prehistoric survival involves mobility itself. Modern people often think of movement as a choice. For ancient human groups, movement is frequently a necessity. When resources decline, relocation may become essential. Communities follow water. They track animal migrations. They seek productive landscapes. Yet movement carries risks. Unfamiliar territory contains unknown dangers. Competing populations may already occupy desirable regions. Predators may be abundant. Water sources may prove unreliable. Migration is not a guaranteed solution. Sometimes it simply exchanges one set of dangers for another. This uncertainty may have contributed to the demographic decline suggested by genetic evidence. As suitable habitats shrink, populations become concentrated into fewer areas. Competition increases. Resource pressure intensifies. Some groups fail to establish themselves in new locations. Others disappear altogether. The survivors persist in scattered pockets of relative stability. Exactly where those refugees existed remains uncertain. Scholars continue debating which regions may have served as long-term havens during periods of climatic stress. Eastern Africa often receives particular attention because of its rich fossil record and environmental diversity. Other regions may also have played important roles. The evidence remains incomplete. The ancient landscape refuses to reveal all its secrets. Yet a broad pattern emerges. Human ancestors appear to have faced a continent becoming less predictable and, in many places, less hospitable. Water sources contracted. Habitats fragmented. Populations became increasingly vulnerable. The bottleneck, if it occurred as proposed, was not merely a reduction in numbers. It was the lived experience of countless generations adapting to a world that no longer behaved as it once had. Children inherited landscapes different from those known by their grandparents. Communities were forced to abandon familiar territories. Entire regions may have become ecological dead ends. And throughout this long struggle, survival depended upon finding places where life remained possible. These refuges, however, were not isolated from the broader transformations reshaping the continent. The environments themselves continued changing. Forests shifted. Grasslands expanded. Water became an increasingly precious resource. The disappearance of favourable habitats may have been one of the most powerful forces driving humanity toward the edge. To understand how severe those pressures became, we must look more closely at the landscapes that were vanishing and the resources that disappeared with them. The loss of a landscape is not always dramatic. Sometimes there is no single moment when a forest dies, no sudden day when a lake vanishes, no clear line separating abundance from scarcity. Instead, the transformation unfolds gradually, almost invisibly, until one generation finds itself living in a world fundamentally different from the one its ancestors knew. For the human population struggling through the period associated with the bottleneck, this slow disappearance may have been one of the greatest dangers of all. A shrinking habitat does more than remove resources. It alters entire ecological relationships. When a forest contracts, the animals dependent upon it must either adapt or leave. When wetlands dry, birds disappear, fish populations collapse, and plant communities change. When rivers become seasonal rather than permanent, migration routes shift and predictable sources of water become uncertain. Humans are woven into these systems. They do not stand apart from them. Every environmental change affects the availability of food, water, shelter, and mobility. One reason scientists pay close attention to ancient landscapes is that human populations are often limited less by intelligence than by ecology. Even highly adaptable groups cannot survive where resources fall below critical thresholds. A skilled hunter cannot hunt animals that are no longer there. A knowledgeable gatherer cannot collect plants that have disappeared. Social cooperation can stretch resources further, but it cannot create food from nothing. The shrinking of habitable environments may therefore have exerted relentless pressure on prehistoric populations. Across parts of Africa, evidence suggests that environmental conditions became increasingly variable. Forested areas that once supported rich biodiversity may have contracted during extended dry phases. Lakes that served as ecological centers diminished. Grasslands expanded into some regions while others became more arid. The precise timing differed from place to place. The continent did not transform uniformly. Yet for many populations, the trend may have been unmistakable. Reliable resources became harder to predict. This uncertainty creates a particular kind of vulnerability. In stable environments, knowledge accumulates efficiently. Communities learn seasonal patterns and pass them to future generations. Predictability itself becomes a survival advantage. In unstable environments, that advantage begins to erode. The rules keep changing. A strategy that worked for decades may suddenly fail. A traditional migration route may no longer lead to water. An area once rich in game may become barren. Adaptation becomes a constant necessity rather than an occasional challenge. One fascinating clue comes from studies of ancient lake systems. Some of Africa's prehistoric lakes were enormous, supporting extensive ecosystems that attracted animals from great distances. During wetter periods, these lakes created productive landscapes capable of sustaining large populations. When conditions shifted, however, many contracted dramatically. Shorelines retreated. Wetlands disappeared. The ecological richness surrounding them declined. For human groups living nearby, the consequences could be profound. Water is not merely another resource. It is the foundation upon which all other resources depend. Animals gather near it. Plants flourish around it. Human movement often follows it. When water becomes scarce, every aspect of survival grows more difficult. The bottleneck hypothesis gains additional plausibility when viewed through this lens. Rather than imagining humanity confronting a single overwhelming disaster, it becomes easier to picture populations gradually squeezed by environmental deterioration. A shrinking lake forces migration. Migration increases competition. Competition reduces survival rates. Smaller populations become more vulnerable to further disruptions. The process feeds upon itself. Another often overlooked factor involves food webs. Human ancestors occupy complex ecological networks. Changes affecting one species can cascade through many others. Suppose prolonged environmental stress reduces herbivore populations. Predators dependent upon those herbivores may also decline. Human hunters lose access to important food sources. Competition for remaining resources intensifies. The effects multiply throughout the ecosystem. No species experiences the crisis alone. Entire biological communities are affected. What survives in the record suggests that Middle Pleistocene Africa was experiencing exactly these kinds of interconnected pressures. Climatic fluctuations altered habitats. Habitats influenced animal populations. Animal populations affected human opportunities for survival. The challenge was cumulative. Every change added another layer of difficulty. One especially important concept is habitat fragmentation. A large continuous environment can support larger populations because resources are distributed across broad areas. Fragmented habitats operate differently. Imagine a landscape broken into isolated islands of suitability. Each patch may still sustain life, but movement between patches becomes harder. Populations become separated. Local extinctions become more likely. Recovery becomes less certain. Many conservation biologists observe similar patterns today. Species often decline not because all habitat disappears, but because remaining habitat becomes disconnected. The same principle may have affected human ancestors. As favourable environments contracted, groups became increasingly isolated from one another. This isolation carries both demographic and genetic consequences. Fewer interactions mean fewer opportunities for genetic exchange. Small populations become more susceptible to random fluctuations. A harsh season that might be survivable for a large connected network becomes devastating for a small isolated community. Over generations, these pressures accumulate. Some populations disappear entirely. Others persist only marginally. A few find ways to endure. The fossil record offers occasional glimpses of this world, but only glimpses. Unlike later periods of human history, the evidence is sparse and uneven. Vast stretches of time contain almost no direct traces. Researchers must reconstruct ancient environments through sediments, fossil pollen, isotope studies, animal remains, and geological indicators. Each line of evidence contributes part of the story. Together they suggest landscapes undergoing profound transformation. Yet the exact details remain elusive. Scholars still debate the severity of environmental deterioration in different regions. Some areas may have remained surprisingly resilient. Others may have experienced far greater stress than current evidence reveals. The uncertainty is unavoidable. Ancient ecosystems rarely preserve themselves neatly. Still, one conclusion emerges repeatedly. The world inhabited by human ancestors was becoming less reliable. Water sources fluctuated. Habitats fragmented. Food resources became harder to predict. Migration became increasingly important yet increasingly risky. The environmental safety margins that once supported broader populations may have narrowed dramatically. For a species already experiencing demographic decline, this was dangerous territory. Every disappearing lake, every shrinking forest, every failed rainy season potentially contributed to a larger pattern unfolding across centuries. The bottleneck was not necessarily caused by one event. It may have been the cumulative result of countless local losses occurring over immense spans of time. A valley abandoned here. Population lost there. A migration that failed. A refuge that could no longer sustain its inhabitants. Viewed individually, such events might seem minor. Viewed collectively, they may have brought humanity closer and closer to extinction. Yet there is a frustrating problem at the centre of this reconstruction. If these changes were truly so significant, where is the evidence? Why do we not find countless archaeological sites documenting the struggle? Why does the record appear so strangely silent during one of the most important periods in human history? The answer lies in one of the greatest challenges facing prehistoric research: the remarkable difficulty of preserving the past across nearly 1 million years. One of the strangest aspects of the ancient bottleneck mystery is that it may represent one of the most important events in human history, while simultaneously leaving behind some of the faintest traces. When people imagine evidence from the past, they often picture archaeological discoveries tools buried in ancient campsites, bones preserved in caves, footprints frozen in sediment, or artifacts emerging from excavations. These discoveries can feel tangible and immediate. They provide physical connections to lives once lived. The Bottleneck period offers far less certainty. Instead of an abundance of evidence, researchers frequently encounter silence. Long stretches of time appear frustratingly empty. Sites are rare. Fossils are scarce. Entire regions preserve little that can be confidently connected to the populations thought to have survived this critical period. At first glance, this absence seems puzzling. If human ancestors were living across Africa and parts of Eurasia, why do they seem to vanish from the archaeological record? The answer begins with understanding how difficult it is for anything to survive nearly 1 million years. The archaeological record is not a complete archive. It is a collection of accidents. Every fossil, every stone tool, every ancient footprint exists because an unlikely sequence of events allowed it to survive destruction. Most traces of the past disappear forever. Consider something as simple as a prehistoric campsite. A group pauses near a water source. They make tools, process food, care for children, and eventually move on. When they leave, little remains. Organic materials decay quickly. Rainfall washes away traces. Animals disturb the ground. Vegetation grows over the site. Within years, much of the evidence may already be gone. Over thousands of years, erosion reshapes the landscape. Over hundreds of thousands of years, rivers shift course, sediments accumulate, and geological processes erase entire surfaces. The survival of any evidence becomes extraordinarily unlikely. This problem grows even more severe when populations are small. A large population leaves many traces. A small population leaves far fewer. If the bottleneck hypothesis is correct and human numbers decline dramatically, then the amount of archaeological material entering the record would naturally decrease. Fewer people create fewer tools. Fewer campsites exist. Fewer individuals leave behind remains. The signal becomes weaker precisely when researchers most want to observe it. This creates a frustrating paradox. The more severe the bottleneck becomes, the harder it is to detect directly through archaeology. Some scientists have noted that parts of the African fossil record around this time frame appear unusually sparse. This observation does not prove a population collapse. Fossil preservation is influenced by countless factors unrelated to demographics. Nevertheless, the scarcity is intriguing. If human populations were shrinking, a reduced fossil record would be exactly what researchers might expect. The difficulty lies in distinguishing genuine demographic decline from the normal incompleteness of ancient evidence. No single fossil can resolve the question. No individual archaeological site can provide a definitive answer. Instead, researchers must look for broader patterns. One reason genetic evidence attracted so much attention is that it appeared to offer information independent of the fossil record. Rather than relying on rare physical remains, scientists could examine biological patterns preserved within living populations. Yet genetics alone cannot reconstruct daily life. DNA may reveal that a bottleneck occurred, but it cannot easily explain what surviving communities experienced. For that, researchers still depend on archaeology, paleo-environmental evidence, and fossils. And those sources remain frustratingly incomplete. A striking example comes from ancient landscapes themselves. Many environments where human ancestors likely lived are poorly preserved today. River valleys, lake shores, floodplains, and wetlands often attract human populations because they provide water and food. Ironically, These same environments are frequently subject to erosion and geological change. A productive landscape today may leave little trace a million years later. Ancient shorelines disappear beneath sediments. Former river channels become difficult to identify. Entire ecosystems vanish from the surface. Finding evidence becomes a matter of extraordinary luck. Researchers sometimes spend years investigating regions that ultimately yield only a handful of artifacts. Even those artifacts can be difficult to interpret. A stone tool reveals behavior, but not population size. A fossil reveals the existence of an individual, but not the broader demographic picture. The challenge resembles attempting to reconstruct an entire civilization, using only a few scattered pages torn from different books. Useful information survives. The full story does not. One lesser-known complication involves sampling bias. Archaeologists can only study places that are accessible and discoverable. Vast portions of ancient Africa remain unexplored or poorly understood from a prehistoric perspective. Political conditions, geography, funding limitations, and simple logistics influence where research occurs. As a result, apparent gaps in the record may sometimes reflect gaps in modern investigation rather than genuine absences in ancient populations. Scholars remain acutely aware of this possibility. The evidence remains incomplete. New discoveries frequently alter established interpretations. A single fossil find can reshape an entire timeline. An overlooked archaeological site can transform understanding of a region. The bottleneck debate unfolds against this backdrop of uncertainty. Researchers are attempting to solve a mystery while knowing that critical evidence may still be buried, destroyed, or undiscovered. Yet even incomplete evidence can reveal important clues. One pattern emerging from multiple lines of research is fragmentation. Human populations appear increasingly scattered. Evidence becomes patchier. Regional continuity becomes harder to trace. This does not prove extinction pressure by itself, but it aligns with the broader picture suggested by genetics and climate records. The different pieces do not fit perfectly. Still, they often point in similar directions. Another fascinating aspect involves what is missing beyond human remains. Animal fossils, environmental indicators, and geological records all suggest ecosystems undergoing significant transformations. These changes provide context even when direct human evidence is scarce. Researchers can sometimes infer human challenges indirectly by studying the environments in which people lived. If water sources decline, human populations likely face stress. If prey animals become less abundant, food acquisition becomes harder. If habitats fragment, mobility becomes increasingly important. The surrounding world becomes a witness when human evidence is absent. This indirect reconstruction requires patience. Science advances slowly in such cases. Every clue must be weighed carefully. Every interpretation must account for uncertainty. The result is not a neat narrative, but a gradually emerging picture. Humanity's ancestors appear to have inhabited a world becoming more unstable. Their numbers may have declined dramatically. Their archaeological footprint became faint. Their fossils became rare. Their story nearly vanished. And perhaps that is the most remarkable aspect of all. If the bottleneck truly occurred, these survivors endured a crisis so profound that they left behind only the faintest traces of their existence. The fact that modern science can detect them at all is extraordinary. Yet environmental pressures alone may not explain everything. The survivors faced another reality shared by every creature on the prehistoric landscape. They were not alone. Across Africa and Eurasia lived powerful predators, competing hominin populations, and countless species pursuing the same limited resources. As habitats shrank and ecological stress intensified, those interactions may have become even more consequential. The struggle for survival was not merely against climate. It was also against the living world itself. A shrinking world changes the behavior of everything that lives within it. When resources are plentiful, different species can often occupy overlapping landscapes with relatively limited conflict. Water sources are abundant, food is accessible, animals disperse across wide territories. Competition exists, but it is diluted by opportunity. When resources become scarce, the situation changes dramatically. The same watering hole suddenly attracts more animals. The same productive valley becomes more valuable. The same patch of surviving habitat must support increasing numbers of creatures seeking refuge. In such circumstances, survival becomes a contest. Human ancestors facing environmental instability were not struggling in isolation. They inhabited ecosystems filled with predators, competitors, and other hominin populations, all responding to the same climatic pressures. Every drought affected more than humans. Every shrinking lake altered the behavior of countless species. Every disappearing habitat intensified competition across entire ecological communities. To understand the bottleneck, it is important to remember that early humans were neither the strongest nor the fastest animals in their environments. They possessed intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability. But physically they remained vulnerable. The African landscapes of the Middle Pleistocene contained an impressive collection of predators. Large cats prowled grasslands and woodlands. Hyenas occupied important ecological roles as both hunters and scavengers. Massive crocodiles lurked in rivers and lakes. Other carnivores competed for territory and prey. For a small human group, encounters with such animals could be deadly. Predation alone probably did not cause the bottleneck. Human ancestors had coexisted with dangerous predators for millions of years. Nevertheless, predation imposed a constant cost. Children were particularly vulnerable. Injuries could prove fatal. A small population losing even a few members each generation might struggle to recover. The risks multiplied when environmental conditions deteriorated. Animals facing resource shortages often alter their behavior. Predators may expand their hunting ranges. Competition intensifies around water sources. Encounters become more frequent. What was once a manageable threat can become significantly more dangerous. Yet predators represented only one challenge. The bottleneck period may also have involved interactions with other members of the human family. The human lineage has rarely existed as a single isolated species. Throughout much of prehistory, multiple hominin groups inhabited different regions simultaneously. Some evolved separately for hundreds of thousands of years, others overlapped geographically. Their relationships remain only partially understood. Around the time frame associated with the bottleneck, species such as Homo erectus and potentially other transitional populations occupied portions of Africa and Eurasia. The boundaries between these groups are often difficult to define. Evolution does not proceed through neat categories. Populations change gradually. Traits emerge unevenly. Species distinctions become blurred. Still, the broader picture suggests a diverse human landscape rather than a single unified population. This diversity raises fascinating questions. If environmental pressures intensified, how did different hominin groups respond? Did some populations prove more resilient than others? Did certain regions support survival while others became demographic traps? The evidence remains incomplete, but scholars increasingly suspect that population fragmentation played an important role. Small isolated groups face challenges that larger connected populations do not. A local drought may wipe out an entire community. Disease outbreaks become more dangerous. Losses are harder to replace. Genetic diversity declines. Meanwhile, Neighbouring populations experiencing similar pressures may be unable to provide assistance because they are struggling as well. The result is a cascading vulnerability. One lesser-known aspect of prehistoric competition involves access to knowledge. Modern societies store information externally through writing, technology, and institutions. Ancient populations depended entirely upon human memory and social transmission. Knowledge existed within people. A skilled hunter knew migration routes. An experienced gatherer recognized edible plants. Elders remembered seasonal patterns and survival strategies. When a small community loses knowledgeable individuals, it loses information. In large populations, that knowledge may survive elsewhere. In small populations, it can disappear completely. This is a subtle but potentially important consequence of demographic decline. The bottleneck may not simply have reduced numbers. It may also have reduced the collective reservoir of survival knowledge available to human populations. Every lost group represented not only fewer individuals but fewer experiences, fewer innovations, and fewer adaptations. The narrowing affected culture as well as genetics. Competition for resources likely intensified these pressures. Imagine several populations relying on a shrinking network of productive habitats. Water remains available in only a handful of locations. Game animals concentrate around surviving resources. Plant foods become less predictable. The most favourable territories become increasingly valuable. Under such conditions, groups may encounter one another more frequently. Some interactions could be cooperative. Others may not. Direct evidence for conflict during this period is scarce, and scholars are cautious about projecting modern assumptions into the distant past. Yet competition need not involve organised violence to have demographic consequences. Simply occupying the best habitats can limit opportunities for others. A population arriving late to a resource-rich refuge may find little room remaining. The ecological outcome is the same. Some groups survive, others do not. Environmental stress often amplifies such inequalities. A productive valley that comfortably supports multiple communities during favourable conditions may become insufficient during prolonged drought. As carrying capacity declines, population pressure increases. The struggle becomes less about expansion and more about persistence. What makes this particularly significant is that human ancestors were already living near ecological limits compared with modern societies. There were no food reserves stored for years, no trade networks spanning continents, no agricultural surpluses. The margin separating survival from disaster could be surprisingly thin. A few failed seasons might have consequences lasting generations. This fragility becomes increasingly important as researchers consider how the bottleneck may have unfolded. Rather than imagining a dramatic extinction event, many scientists envision a prolonged period during which countless local populations gradually disappeared. Some succumbed to environmental deterioration. Others failed to adapt to changing conditions. Still others may have been overwhelmed by the cumulative effects of competition, isolation, predation, and resource scarcity. The process resembles erosion more than explosion. Small losses accumulate, options diminish, resilience weakens, population numbers decline. Eventually only a limited number of communities remain. And yet those communities do remain. That is perhaps the most remarkable part of the story. Despite climatic instability, shrinking habitats, competition, predation, and demographic decline, human ancestors do not disappear entirely. Somewhere within Africa, perhaps in multiple refugees scattered across the continent, populations find ways to endure. They survive long enough to become the ancestors of future generations. How they accomplished this remains one of the central mysteries of the bottleneck. Did geography protect them? Did social cooperation make the difference? Did technological innovations provide crucial advantages, or was survival partly a matter of chance? No single explanation fully accounts for the outcome. The evidence points towards several possibilities, each offering part of the answer, and among them are some of the most intriguing theories ever proposed about one of the greatest survival stories in human history. When scientists attempt to explain how humanity survived the proposed bottleneck, they face a problem that is both fascinating and frustrating. The outcome is obvious. Human beings are here. The cause is not, somewhere during a period of environmental instability, demographic decline, and ecological pressure, a small remnant population endured while countless other branches of human ancestry vanished from the record. The survivors persisted long enough to rebuild numbers, expand into new regions, and eventually give rise to later human populations. The challenge is determining why. What separated the survivors from those who disappeared? No single answer has emerged. Instead, researchers have proposed a collection of overlapping explanations, each supported by pieces of evidence and each limited by the uncertainties surrounding such an ancient event. One possibility is that survival depended primarily upon geography. Certain regions may simply have remained more hospitable than others. This idea is appealing because it aligns with patterns observed throughout natural history. During periods of climatic stress, species often survive in environmental refugia areas where local conditions remain favorable even while surrounding regions deteriorate. If parts of Africa retain dependable water sources, productive vegetation, and stable animal populations, they could have functioned as lifeboats during the broader crisis. Small human populations concentrated within these refuges might have persisted while populations elsewhere declined. The concept makes intuitive sense. It also helps explain how a species can survive severe environmental change without requiring extraordinary technological innovations. Sometimes survival comes down to being in the right place. Yet geography alone may not tell the whole story. Refuges still have limits. A favourable environment can support only so many individuals. If population pressure becomes too intense, resources may become scarce even within relatively productive regions. Furthermore, environmental conditions continued fluctuating throughout the period associated with the bottleneck. Refugees were not necessarily permanent havens. They may have shifted over time, forcing populations to remain adaptable. Another major explanation emphasizes mobility. Human ancestors possessed a significant advantage over many species, the ability to move strategically in response to changing conditions. Migration is often difficult and dangerous, but it can also be life-saving. A shrinking habitat need not become a death sentence if populations can relocate before conditions become catastrophic. Researchers have suggested that highly mobile groups may have tracked water sources, followed animal migrations, and shifted territories as environments changed. Rather than remaining trapped within deteriorating landscapes, they continually adjusted their movements to match ecological opportunities. This flexibility may have increased survival odds dramatically. Still, mobility has limitations. Moving requires energy. New territories may contain unfamiliar dangers. Suitable destinations may already be occupied. Migration helps only if viable habitats exist somewhere else. Thus, mobility and geography likely work together rather than independently. The most successful populations may have been those capable of finding and exploiting favorable environments as conditions evolved. A third explanation focuses on social organization. Among all human adaptations, cooperation may be the most powerful. Physical strength alone does not explain humanity's evolutionary success. Many animals are stronger, faster, or better equipped for survival in harsh environments. What distinguishes humans is their capacity to share information, coordinate behavior, and support one another. Even relatively small advantages in cooperation can produce significant survival benefits. Knowledge spreads. Resources are shared. Childcare becomes collective. Injured individuals may survive with assistance from others. Groups can divide tasks and manage risks more effectively. During periods of environmental instability, these social advantages may become especially important. A solitary individual facing a drought has few options. A coordinated community possesses many more. Some anthropologists believe that increasingly sophisticated social behavior may have helped human populations weather conditions that would otherwise have proven devastating. If true, the bottleneck becomes not merely a story of biological survival, but a story of cooperation itself. The communities that endured may have done so because they functioned more effectively as groups. There is also the possibility that human ancestors were becoming behaviorally more innovative during this period. The archaeological evidence remains limited, but some researchers argue that evolutionary pressures may have encouraged greater flexibility in problem solving. When environments become unpredictable, innovation acquires enormous value. A new hunting strategy, a more efficient way to process food, improved understanding of seasonal resources. Even small behavioral improvements can accumulate into meaningful survival advantages. The fossil and archaeological records from this era are too fragmentary to document such changes clearly. Yet the possibility remains intriguing. Environmental crises often reward adaptability. Populations capable of experimenting and learning may fare better than those relying exclusively on established routines. Another theory introduces an element that many people find uncomfortable: chance. History often encourages the illusion that outcomes were inevitable. The bottleneck challenges that assumption. When populations become very small, randomness matters. A favourable sequence of rainy seasons. A refuge that remains productive slightly longer than expected. The survival of a few key communities. These events can influence long-term outcomes far more than they would in large populations. The farther numbers decline, the more sensitive a species becomes to luck. This does not mean survival was purely accidental. Human ancestors clearly possessed traits that enabled persistence. But chance may have played a larger role than many people realize. A different sequence of environmental events might have produced a very different future. One particularly interesting debate concerns whether multiple refugees existed simultaneously. Rather than a single surviving population, humanity's ancestors may have persisted in several scattered regions connected by occasional movement and genetic exchange. This model helps explain certain aspects of genetic diversity, while avoiding the need to imagine all survivors concentrated in one isolated location. It also aligns with the broader pattern of human populations occupying varied environments across Africa. The truth may involve a combination of factors. Geography provides refuge. Mobility enables access. Cooperation increases resilience. Innovation improves adaptation. Chance influences outcomes. No single explanation fully accounts for survival, because survival itself was probably the product of many interacting forces. This complexity is common in evolutionary history. Major events rarely result from one cause alone. Instead, they emerge from the convergence of multiple pressures and opportunities. The bottleneck appears to fit that pattern. Humanity may have survived not because of one decisive advantage, but because several advantages work together at precisely the right time. Yet among all the theories, two possibilities continue attracting particular attention. The first is the growing importance of cooperation. The second is the possibility that control of fire or increasingly sophisticated use of it provided a crucial edge during difficult times. Both involve abilities that would later become defining features of human success. And if either played a significant role during the bottleneck, then the ancestors who survived were not merely enduring a crisis. They were beginning to develop some of the very traits that would eventually allow humanity to transform the world. If there is a single theme that echoes through the entire human story, it is that survival rarely depends on strength alone. Across millions of years, our ancestors repeatedly encountered animals that were larger, faster, better armed, and often better adapted to specific environments. Yet those animals did not build civilizations. They did not spread across nearly every ecosystem on Earth. Many eventually disappeared while humanity endured. The difference may lie in a combination of cooperation, learning, and the ability to reshape relationships with the environment. During the period associated with the ancient bottleneck, those qualities may have become more important than ever. Imagine a small population living through prolonged ecological instability. Resources are unpredictable. Habitats are fragmented. Migration routes shift. Environmental knowledge becomes invaluable. In such conditions, survival is not merely about finding food today. It is about transmitting information that allows future generations to survive tomorrow. A community that shares knowledge effectively gains a tremendous advantage. Someone discovers a reliable water source during a drought. Others learn its location. A group develops a more efficient way to process food. The technique spreads. Experience accumulates. Knowledge becomes a form of adaptation. Unlike biological evolution, which unfolds across generations, cultural knowledge can spread within a lifetime. This distinction may have been critical. Human ancestors could respond to changing conditions far more rapidly than many other species. They did not need to wait for favorable genetic mutations. They could observe, learn, remember, and teach. Even simple improvements could make meaningful differences during periods of demographic stress. The archaeological evidence from nearly 900,000 years ago remains sparse, making it difficult to identify specific innovations with certainty. Nevertheless, researchers increasingly recognize that behavioral flexibility was likely among the most powerful tools available to early humans. Flexibility creates resilience. A population dependent upon one resource is vulnerable when that resource disappears. A population capable of exploiting multiple resources possesses more options. This may help explain why human ancestors persisted despite environmental transformations that affected countless other species. One lesser-known aspect of survival involves social networks themselves. Modern people often underestimate how biologically important cooperation can be. Among many animals, individuals become largely independent shortly after birth. Humans follow a very different pattern. Human children require extended care. They learn gradually. They depend upon others for years. This dependence encourages complex social structures. Parents, relatives, and community members all contribute to survival. Knowledge accumulates across generations rather than beginning anew each time. The result is a species uniquely capable of collective adaptation. During a bottleneck, such social systems may become even more valuable. Small populations face constant risks. The loss of a skilled hunter, experienced gatherer, or knowledgeable elder can have serious consequences. Communities that support one another effectively may be better able to absorb those losses. Cooperation becomes a buffer against uncertainty. Researchers studying human evolution often emphasize that social intelligence may have been as important as technological innovation. The ability to maintain alliances, share resources, coordinate activities, and transmit information likely enhance survival prospects across a wide range of environments. The bottleneck may represent one of the clearest demonstrations of that principle. Yet cooperation alone does not fully explain humanity's endurance. Another possibility has captured scientific interest for decades: fire. Few developments altered human history more profoundly than the ability to control and use fire. Fire provides warmth. It offers protection. It extends activity into darkness. It transforms food. It changes landscapes. Eventually, it becomes central to nearly every aspect of human civilization. The question is how much control over fire human ancestors possessed during the Bottleneck period. The answer remains uncertain. Evidence for early fire use exists at several archaeological sites, but interpreting that evidence is notoriously difficult. Natural fires occur regularly. Distinguishing accidental exposure from deliberate control is not always straightforward. Some researchers argue that increasingly sophisticated fire use may have emerged around this broader time frame. Others remain more cautious. Scholars still debate exactly when habitual fire control became widespread. The evidence remains incomplete. Nevertheless, even limited use of fire could provide significant advantages. Warmth becomes especially important during cooler climatic periods. Predators may be deterred. Certain foods become easier to digest when cooked. Cooking can increase the energy obtained from some resources, effectively expanding available food supplies. These benefits matter. A population surviving near ecological limits gains value from every additional calorie, every reduced risk, every improved chance of enduring a difficult season. Fire also allows humans to modify environments in subtle ways. Controlled burning can influence vegetation patterns and animal movements. Later populations certainly used such techniques. Whether groups during the Bottleneck period did so intentionally remains uncertain, but the possibility highlights how unusual human adaptation had already become. Rather than merely responding to environments, humans increasingly interacted with them in active ways. This shift may have contributed to long-term resilience. Another intriguing possibility involves dietary flexibility. Environmental instability often rewards species capable of exploiting diverse food sources. Human ancestors were becoming increasingly versatile in this regard. They gathered plant foods. They consumed animal resources. They scavenged opportunistically. They adapted strategies to local conditions. Such flexibility reduces dependence on any single ecological niche. When one resource declines, alternatives may remain available. This does not eliminate hardship. It simply improves the odds of survival. Over thousands of years, small advantages accumulate. A slightly broader diet, a slightly stronger social network, a slightly better understanding of local environments. Each advantage seems modest in isolation. Together they may determine whether a population persists or disappears. One fascinating aspect of the bottleneck is that it may have functioned as a kind of evolutionary filter, not in the simplistic sense of selecting the strongest individuals, but in the broader sense of favouring traits that enhanced resilience under difficult conditions. Populations capable of adapting to uncertainty survived. Those less able to do so often vanished. The consequences extended beyond the immediate crisis. The descendants of the survivors inherited the legacy of those adaptations. Every later human population emerged from ancestors who successfully navigated one of the most challenging periods in our history. In that sense, the bottleneck was not merely a test. It was also a turning point. The populations that endured carried forward genetic traits, social behaviours, and adaptive capacities that would shape future evolution. By surviving, they altered the trajectory of humanity itself. And as the bottleneck gradually loosened and population numbers began recovering, something remarkable appears to happen. Out of this long period of decline and survival emerges a new chapter in human evolution, one that may ultimately lead toward the later forms of humanity familiar from the fossil record. The near extinction of our ancestors may have left permanent marks on who we became. Survival is often remembered as an ending. A crisis occurs, the danger passes, and life continues. But in evolutionary history, survival is frequently the beginning of something else. The populations that emerge from a bottleneck are not identical to the populations that entered it. Some genetic diversity has been lost. Certain lineages have vanished. Others become disproportionately important because they happen to belong to the survivors. Over time, these changes can influence the future direction of an entire species. If humanity truly passed through a severe bottleneck around 900,000 years ago, the consequences may have extended far beyond the immediate challenge of avoiding extinction. They may have helped shape the next phase of human evolution. This idea remains one of the most intriguing aspects of the mystery. Researchers have long noticed that important developments appear in the broader span of human evolution during the Middle Pleistocene. The fossil record, incomplete though it is, suggests that populations existing after the proposed bottleneck begin showing characteristics that distinguish them from earlier ancestors. The picture is complicated. Evolution rarely proceeds in neat stages. Different traits emerge at different times. Regional populations follow different paths. The boundaries between species remain subjects of ongoing debate. Yet many scientists see this period as an important transitional era. Some researchers have proposed that demographic changes associated with the bottleneck may have contributed to evolutionary shifts later visible in the fossil record. The logic is straightforward. When populations become small, the genetic makeup of future generations becomes more heavily influenced by the traits present among survivors. Variations carried by those survivors spread more widely through subsequent populations. This does not mean the bottleneck directly created new traits. Evolution remains a gradual process involving mutation, selection, migration, and chance. However, a severe demographic contraction can alter which traits become common and which disappear. The bottleneck may therefore have acted as a powerful filter. Imagine a vast collection of genetic possibilities existing before the crisis. Many vanish as populations decline. A smaller subset passes through the bottleneck. Future generations inherit primarily from that surviving subset. The result is a human lineage that carries the imprint of ancient survival. One particularly fascinating development involves brain evolution. Human brains had already been increasing in size long before the bottleneck, yet the broader Middle Pleistocene is associated with continued changes in cognition, behavior, and anatomy across several hominin populations. Scientists remain cautious about linking these developments directly to the bottleneck itself. The evidence does not allow such simple conclusions. Nevertheless, it is difficult to ignore the possibility that populations surviving prolonged environmental instability face strong pressures favoring flexibility, learning, and cooperation. Those qualities may have become increasingly important in later human evolution. Another significant consequence concerns population structure. Before the bottleneck, human ancestors may have existed in numerous semi-connected groups spread across large territories. After a severe demographic contraction, the relationships among surviving populations could change dramatically. Some lineages disappear entirely. Others become central to future ancestry. Migration patterns shift. Genetic exchange follows new pathways. The human family tree becomes narrower. This narrowing does not mean diversity vanishes altogether. Far from it. Human populations continue evolving across varied environments. Regional differences remain important. New lineages emerge and spread. Yet the genetic foundation from which later populations arise may be substantially different from what existed before the crisis. One reason this matters is that later human evolution appears increasingly dynamic. Around and after this general time frame, fossil evidence points toward populations often grouped under categories such as Homo heidelbergensis. Though classifications remain debated, these populations are thought by many researchers to be connected to the ancestry of later groups, including both modern humans and other branches of the human family. The exact relationships remain complex. Paleoanthropology is filled with unresolved questions. New discoveries regularly challenge established assumptions. Yet many scientists view the Middle Pleistocene as a period of important evolutionary transformation. The bottleneck, if confirmed, would sit near the heart of that transformation, not as a solitary cause, but as part of the broader context in which evolutionary change occurred. Environmental instability may have played a role as well. Repeated climatic fluctuations create shifting selective pressures. Adaptations useful in one environment may become less valuable in another. Populations capable of flexibility gain advantages. Over thousands of generations, these pressures shape evolutionary trajectories. The bottleneck may therefore represent both a demographic event and an ecological one. The survivors were not merely surviving fewer numbers. They were surviving within a changing world that continued exerting evolutionary influence. One lesser-known implication involves innovation itself. Small populations often face disadvantages, but they can also become highly adaptive under certain circumstances. Survival depends upon solving problems efficiently. Communities unable to adjust disappear. The populations that persist are, by definition, those capable of coping with uncertainty. This does not guarantee technological breakthroughs. However, it may encourage behavioral flexibility, experimentation, and social learning. Traits associated with later human success may have roots in these prolonged struggles. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how strongly the bottleneck influenced subsequent evolution. Some researchers see it as a major turning point. Others argue that human evolution was shaped more by broader environmental and demographic processes than by any single bottleneck event. No single explanation fully accounts for the complexity of the fossil and genetic records. The truth likely involves multiple interacting factors. Still, the possibility is difficult to dismiss. A severe demographic contraction occurring during a period of environmental upheaval and evolutionary change would almost certainly leave consequences. The survivors would not simply rebuild what existed before, they would create something different. Over time, populations expanded again. Numbers increased. Groups spread into new regions. The immediate danger receded. Yet the legacy of the bottleneck remained embedded within the descendants of those ancient survivors. Every generation carried traces of the narrowing. Every migration began from populations shaped by it. Every later branch of human history emerged from ancestors who had passed through one of the most fragile moments in our existence. And yet, despite the elegance of this narrative, science remains far from unanimous. The bottleneck hypothesis continues to generate intense discussion among researchers. Some find the genetic evidence compelling. Others urge caution. Important questions remain unresolved. The story may be broadly correct, partially correct, or more complicated than current models suggest. To understand the mystery fully, we must examine the debates themselves and explore why one of the most dramatic claims in human evolutionary history remains a subject of active scientific disagreement. Few scientific discoveries travel a straight path from proposal to acceptance. The public often imagines breakthroughs arriving with certainty, as though a new finding appears and the debate immediately ends. In reality, science advances through questioning, testing, criticism, and revision. The strongest ideas survive not because they avoid scrutiny, but because they withstand it. The ancient bottleneck hypothesis is no exception. The possibility that humanity nearly vanished around 900,000 years ago is undeniably dramatic. It captures attention because the implications are so profound. If correct, it would represent one of the most consequential episodes in our evolutionary history. Yet dramatic claims demand careful examination. From the moment researchers began presenting evidence for a severe bottleneck, other scientists started asking difficult questions. Could the genetic signal be interpreted differently? Were the population estimates reliable? Did the models capture the true complexity of ancient human populations? Could alternative explanations produce similar patterns? These questions remain central to the ongoing debate. One of the most important issues involves the nature of genetic modeling itself. Genetics provides extraordinary insights into the past, but it does not function like a time machine. Researchers cannot directly observe populations living 900,000 years ago. Instead, they use mathematical models to reconstruct likely demographic histories from patterns preserved in modern genomes. Those models are powerful. They are also sensitive to assumptions. Mutation rates matter. Population structure matters. Migration patterns matter. Even small differences in assumptions can influence results. This does not mean the findings are unreliable. It simply means that scientific interpretations must account for uncertainty. Some researchers argue that the bottleneck signal is robust and appears across multiple analyses. Others suggest that ancient population structures may complicate the picture. To understand the concern, imagine several human populations living in different regions with limited interaction between them. Over time, genetic differences accumulate. If those populations later reconnect or merge, the resulting genetic patterns can sometimes resemble the signature of a bottleneck. In other words, population fragmentation may produce effects that look similar to population collapse. This possibility does not necessarily invalidate the bottleneck hypothesis. It simply introduces another layer of complexity. Perhaps humanity's ancestors were not reduced to quite such low numbers. Perhaps the key process involved isolation rather than extreme demographic decline. Or perhaps both occurred simultaneously. The evidence does not yet allow definitive answers. Another area of debate concerns timing. Dating ancient demographic events is extraordinarily challenging. Genetic estimates often come with ranges rather than precise dates. Different methodologies can produce somewhat different timelines. The proposed bottleneck falls broadly within a period of significant climatic instability, which many researchers consider an important point in its favour. Yet the exact alignment remains uncertain. Did environmental changes directly trigger demographic decline? Did the bottleneck unfold gradually across many thousands of years? Were multiple episodes of population reduction involved rather than a single prolonged event? Scholars continue exploring these possibilities. The fossil record introduces additional complications. If humanity experienced a severe bottleneck, some researchers argue that stronger supporting evidence might eventually emerge from paleoanthropology. Others counter that expecting such evidence may be unrealistic. The fossil record is notoriously incomplete. Entire populations can disappear without leaving identifiable remains. The absence of evidence does not necessarily constitute evidence of absence. This tension lies at the heart of many debates about deep prehistory. Researchers are attempting to reconstruct events from fragments. Some fragments fit neatly, others do not. One particularly interesting discussion involves scale. How close did humanity actually come to extinction? Popular accounts sometimes present the bottleneck as though only a few hundred individuals remained alive on Earth. Most scientists are more cautious. The distinction between effective breeding population and actual population size remains crucial. A low effective population size does not automatically mean only a few hundred or thousand individuals existed. The real number may have been significantly larger. This nuance often disappears in headlines but remains important within scientific discussions. The question is not whether humanity literally stood one step from extinction. The question is how severely ancestral populations contracted and what consequences followed. Even a less extreme bottleneck could have profound evolutionary effects. Another challenge involves the diversity of evidence itself. Different scientific disciplines approach the mystery from different directions. Geneticists examine DNA and paleoanthropologists study fossils. Archaeologists investigate material culture. Geologists reconstruct ancient environments. Climate scientists analyze long-term environmental change. Each field contributes valuable information, yet these fields do not always produce perfectly synchronized narratives. Sometimes evidence aligns beautifully. Sometimes it generates new questions. This is not a flaw in science. It is how science works. Reality is often more complicated than any single explanation. One lesser-known aspect of the debate concerns the possibility that future discoveries may dramatically alter current understanding. Human evolutionary research is advancing rapidly. New fossils continue to emerge. Ancient environmental records are improving. Genetic techniques grow increasingly sophisticated. Ideas that seem persuasive today may be revised tomorrow. The history of paleoanthropology contains many examples of major reinterpretations driven by unexpected discoveries. Entire species have been identified from fossils that remained unknown for centuries. Migration patterns once considered impossible have become widely accepted. Long-standing assumptions have been overturned repeatedly. The bottleneck hypothesis exists within this evolving scientific landscape. Researchers recognize both its promise and its limitations. Despite the debates, one point commands surprisingly broad agreement. Something important appears to have happened during this period. The exact details remain uncertain, but multiple lines of evidence suggest that human populations experienced significant demographic and environmental challenges during the Middle Pleistocene. The argument increasingly centers on interpretation rather than outright dismissal. How severe was the decline? How long did it last? What mechanisms drove it? How much did it influence later evolution? These questions remain open, and that openness is part of what makes the mystery so compelling. Science has not yet delivered a final verdict. Instead, it has revealed a fascinating possibility and invited further investigation. The ancient bottleneck occupies a space between certainty and speculation, supported by evidence yet still surrounded by unanswered questions. Perhaps future discoveries will confirm the most dramatic interpretations. Perhaps they will reveal a more complex reality. Either way, the investigation has already transformed our understanding of human origins. Because even if the details change, one conclusion remains difficult to escape. Modern humanity carries traces of an ancient past far more fragile than once imagined. The echoes of that fragility may still exist within every person alive today, hidden within the genetic inheritance passed down from those distant survivors. Every human being alive today carries a history far older than memory. Long before written language, before agriculture, before cities, before even the earliest myths, countless generations passed their genetic inheritance forward through time. Most of those individuals left behind no names, no monuments, and no stories. Their lives vanished into prehistory. Yet something of them remains. It survives inside us. This is one of the most remarkable consequences of modern genetics. The same biological information that allows scientists to investigate ancient bottlenecks also reveals a deeper truth about humanity itself. Despite the enormous diversity visible across the world today, human beings are genetically strikingly similar. This fact often surprises people. Modern populations differ in appearance, language, culture, and history. The variety is extraordinary. Yet beneath those differences lies a level of genetic similarity far greater than many would expect for a species occupying nearly every continent. Part of that similarity reflects our relatively recent shared ancestry. Part may also reflect the demographic narrowing that occurred deep in the past. If the bottleneck hypothesis is broadly correct, then the ancestors who survived that crisis contributed disproportionately to all future generations. Their descendants expanded. Their genetic lineages spread. Over immense spans of time, those lineages became the foundation of modern humanity. The implications are profound. Every family alive today traces its ancestry through the same narrow passage. Every nation, every culture, every language group, every community. The divisions that often seem so significant in the present become remarkably small when viewed against the backdrop of nearly 1 million years. At the scale of deep time, humanity resembles a vast extended family whose branches repeatedly converge. This does not mean all genetic variation disappeared during the bottleneck. Human populations continued evolving afterward. New mutations appeared, regional differences emerged, migration patterns created additional complexity, yet the underlying connection remained. The survivors of the bottleneck, whoever and wherever they were, became ancestors to everyone. One fascinating aspect of genetic research is its ability to reveal relationships that would otherwise remain invisible. A person living in Asia, Africa, Europe, Oceania, or the Americas may seem separated from others by geography and history. Genetically, however, those separations are surprisingly recent. The deeper one travels into the past, the more human ancestry converges. Eventually, the countless branches merge into a smaller and smaller set of ancestral populations. The bottleneck may represent one of the most dramatic points of convergence. Imagine a vast river system viewed from above. Countless streams flow across the landscape. As one traces them backward, tributaries join together. The network becomes narrower. The number of channels decreases. Eventually, much of the water passes through a remarkably limited set of routes. The human story may follow a similar pattern. Our modern diversity emerges from ancestors who survived extraordinary demographic challenges. Another intriguing consequence involves the loss of genetic possibilities. When populations decline, some lineages disappear forever. Certain genetic variations vanish with them. Future generations never inherit those possibilities. This process has occurred repeatedly throughout evolutionary history. Species rise and fall. Populations expand and contract. Genetic diversity is gained and lost. The bottleneck may represent one of the largest such losses experienced by the human lineage. We cannot know exactly what disappeared. The lost branches left no descendants. Their genetic contributions ended with them. In a sense, modern humanity is shaped not only by what survived but also by what did not. The survivors carried one version of the future. Many alternative versions vanished. This realization introduces an element of contingency into human history. The world we know was not guaranteed. The people who survived the bottleneck passed along a particular subset of humanity's ancient diversity. Had different populations endured, the genetic landscape of later humans might have looked somewhat different. Not necessarily better or worse, simply different. One lesser-known area of research explores how ancient demographic events continue influencing modern genetic patterns. Scientists examine signatures left behind by population expansions, migrations, and contractions. Some of these signals remain detectable astonishingly far into the past. The Bottleneck is one example. Although nearly 900,000 years may separate us from the event, traces of it appear to persist within contemporary genomes. DNA functions almost like a geological formation. Layers accumulate. New information is added. Older information becomes harder to detect. Yet some deep structures remain visible. Researchers continue refining methods capable of reading those ancient layers with increasing precision. Each improvement reveals more about the journeys taken by our ancestors. At the same time, the Bottleneck reminds us of the limits of certainty. The genetic traces are powerful but not complete. They provide clues rather than perfect reconstructions. The survivors themselves remain largely anonymous. We do not know their names. We do not know their languages. We do not know their beliefs, if such concepts can even be applied to populations living nearly 1 million years ago. We know only that they endured. Somewhere on a changing continent, small communities persisted through environmental upheaval, ecological uncertainty, and demographic decline. Their success was sufficient. That is the astonishing part. The Bottleneck did not need millions of survivors. It needed enough. Enough individuals to maintain continuity, enough children to reach adulthood, enough communities to preserve knowledge, enough resilience to endure another generation. Then another. Then another. Over time, the crisis passed. Population numbers recovered. New evolutionary chapters unfolded. The descendants of those survivors spread outward across the world. Much later, they crossed deserts, mountains, forests, and oceans. They built civilizations. They created art and science. They studied stars and atoms. Eventually, they developed the tools necessary to discover the Bottleneck itself. In one of history's most extraordinary circles, the descendants of the survivors became capable of investigating the ancient crisis that made their own existence possible. And as researchers continue uncovering clues, the mystery invites a final reflection, not merely on genetics or climate or evolution, but on survival itself. Because the story of the Bottleneck is ultimately the story of how close humanity may have come to disappearing, and how much of the modern world depends upon the success of a surprisingly small number of ancient lives. When viewed across the vast sweep of time, human history often appears inevitable. The story seems to flow naturally from primitive beginnings toward increasing complexity. Small groups become larger populations, technologies improve, societies expand, civilizations emerge, scientific knowledge accumulates. The present feels like the expected outcome of everything that came before. The ancient Bottleneck challenges that comforting illusion. Instead of inevitability, it reveals fragility. Instead of certainty, it reveals contingency. Instead of a smooth ascent, it reveals a narrow escape. Nearly 900,000 years ago, if current evidence is even approximately correct, humanity's ancestors entered one of the most dangerous periods in their existence. Environmental instability reshaped landscapes, habitats fragmented, populations declined, genetic diversity narrowed, entire branches of the human story disappeared. The descendants of those lost populations never reached the present. Their journeys ended long before recorded history began. What remains is the legacy of the survivors. The remarkable thing is not that they understood the significance of their survival. They did not. No ancient community gathered around a fire aware that it was preserving the future of an entire species. No one knew they were passing through a demographic bottleneck. No one could imagine the distant descendants who would one day inhabit every continent. The survivors were focused on immediate realities: finding water, locating food, protecting children, navigating landscapes that no longer behaved as previous generations expected. Their achievements were measured in days and seasons rather than millennia. Yet from the perspective of deep time, those ordinary acts of survival became extraordinary. A child reaching adulthood mattered. A community enduring another drought mattered. Knowledge surviving another generation mattered. The future of humanity may have depended on countless such moments. This perspective transforms how we think about evolutionary history. The bottleneck was not won through a single dramatic victory. There was no decisive battle, no heroic turning point. Instead, survival emerged from persistence. Small successes accumulated. Communities adapted. Individuals endured. The species continued. In many ways, that pattern remains familiar. Throughout history, human societies have repeatedly faced environmental change, disease, migration, conflict, and uncertainty. Civilizations rise and fall. Populations expand and contract. Landscapes transform. Yet survival often depends on the same qualities that may have carried our ancestors through the bottleneck: adaptability, cooperation, learning, resilience. The scale changes, but the underlying principles remain surprisingly consistent. One of the most intriguing lessons from the bottleneck involves humility. Modern humanity possesses technologies capable of reshaping entire environments. We monitor weather from space, we sequence genomes, we communicate instantly across continents. These achievements can create the impression that human success was somehow guaranteed. The bottleneck suggests otherwise. For most of our existence, survival was uncertain. The line separating continuation from extinction may have been far thinner than we once imagined. That realization places modern humanity within a broader natural context. We are not separate from Earth's history. We are products of it. Climate shifts influenced our ancestors. Ecological changes shaped our evolution. Geological forces helped determine where populations survived and where they disappeared. The human story has always been intertwined with the story of the planet itself. The bottleneck also highlights the extraordinary power of scientific investigation. Nearly 1 million years separate us from the proposed event. The survivors left no written records. Their campsites largely vanished. Their voices disappeared into silence long ago. And yet modern researchers have managed to recover traces of their existence. Fragments preserved in DNA, clues embedded in sediments, signals hidden within ancient climates, patterns emerging from fossils and stone tools. Individually, these fragments seem incomplete. Together they reveal glimpses of a forgotten world. The mystery remains unfinished. Future discoveries may revise current interpretations, new fossils may emerge, improved genetic methods may refine timelines and population estimates. Alternative explanations may gain support. Science continues moving forward. The evidence remains incomplete. Scholars still debate important details. No single explanation fully accounts for every aspect of the story. Yet uncertainty does not diminish the significance of the question. If anything, it enhances it. The bottleneck sits at the intersection of some of humanity's deepest mysteries. Who were our ancestors? How vulnerable were they? What allowed them to survive when so many others disappeared? How much of our present world depends upon decisions, adaptations, and accidents that occurred nearly 1 million years ago? These questions reach beyond archaeology or genetics. They touch something fundamentally human. The desire to understand where we came from. The desire to understand how improbable our existence may be. The desire to see ourselves not merely as inhabitants of the present, but as participants in a story extending far beyond memory Perhaps that is why the bottleneck continues to capture attention. It reminds us that the modern world rests upon foundations far older and more fragile than most people realize. Every city, every language, every culture, every scientific achievement ultimately traces backward through generations that survived immense uncertainty. At some point in the distant past, the future narrowed dramatically. A great many paths ended. A few continued. From those surviving paths emerged everything that followed. The ancestors who endured the bottleneck could never have imagined the world their descendants would create. They could not foresee agriculture, writing, industry, or spaceflight. They could not imagine nations, libraries, or digital networks. They knew only the landscapes around them and the challenges of another day. Yet their survival made all later possibilities possible. And so the mystery of the bottleneck is ultimately not only about extinction, it is about continuity. It is about how a small number of lives carried a lineage through one of the darkest chapters in its history. It is about how close humanity may have come to disappearing. And it is about how, against remarkable odds, it did not. In the end, the bottleneck invites us to picture a world almost beyond imagination. Not the crowded planet of today, but a quieter Earth nearly 1 million years ago. The skies are vast. The landscapes stretch for hundreds of miles. Rivers wind through valleys untouched by roads or cities. Grasslands ripple beneath changing winds. Somewhere within those immense spaces, small groups of human ancestors move through an uncertain world. They leave few traces: a footprint pressed into mud, a stone tool abandoned near water, a campfire whose ashes will soon disappear. Most evidence of their existence fades. The land reclaims it. Generations pass. The climate changes again. Lakes expand and shrink. Animals migrate. Entire populations vanish from memory. Yet a few communities endure. They survive seasons of scarcity. They adapt to unfamiliar conditions. They teach children what they have learned. One generation hands life to the next. The chain remains unbroken. Across thousands of years, that continuity becomes the most important fact in human history. Not because the survivors were numerous, not because they were powerful, but because they lasted. Long enough for recovery, long enough for populations to expand once more, long enough for new chapters of human evolution to unfold. The world around them continues changing, but the lineage survives. Eventually their descendants spread across continents. They cross mountains, deserts, and oceans. They create stories to explain the world. They build civilizations. They study the past. And much later they uncover faint clues pointing back toward those distant survivors. The people who nearly vanished. The people who may have carried humanity through its narrowest passage. The people whose names are lost, whose faces are forgotten, and whose existence is remembered only through traces preserved in genes and stone. As the centuries drift into millennia and the millennia into deep time, their story becomes part of a larger truth. Civilizations rise and fall. Landscapes transform. Species appear and disappear. Nothing remains unchanged forever. And yet sometimes, against extraordinary odds, a fragile thread endures. Humanity may be one of those threads. A lineage that passed through uncertainty, survived a near-forgotten crisis, and continued onward through the immense darkness of time. Somewhere in that ancient world, beneath unfamiliar stars, the future of our species quietly persisted. And from that persistence came everything.